Hi, I'm Gene Epstein, director of the Soho Forum, here to do the first installment of Ask Gene Anything, our feature in the Soho Forum Inner Circle. We've got a lot of good questions to deal with. I'm going to take only about 30 minutes to cover as many as I can, and those I won't have time to cover we'll cover in the next episode. I guess I should tell you, since you see the background of this image, that I'm doing this from my loft apartment, which I share with my wife, Isako. And in the background, the strange thing you see is my Schwinn Airdyne, my exercise machine, which I highly recommend. And that's the fan, which blows on my face. And when I sit on the Airdyne, I watch an immense screen, a projector, TV, and I watch all my favorite shows, including many of my favorite movies. And that segues into the first question I want to answer, the softball question, which comes to me from Ankush Narula. What are your top 5 favorite films about the abuse of government power? I have a list of, I guess, 7 to 8 films, Ankush, and I didn't want to leave any out that I really liked. I should say that I have a strong bias against message movies. I think that most of the time they don't work. And I've seen a few that have a very specifically abuse of government power, libertarian theme, and unfortunately, they suffer because the characters and the plot and the rest of it seem contrived to serve the purposes of the theme. So it's a very difficult genre to navigate. On the other hand, I've also found, I smile when I think about this, I've known people who, whenever they like a movie, they say, oh, that's a movie, that's a libertarian film. I knew a guy who decided that Rob Roy was a libertarian film. It's really not. I can't say that it's quite about government abuse of power because it seems to imply that government is okay as long as you've got the right government. It's a little bit ambiguous in that regard, so I can't regard films like that as being truly libertarian. I also smile when I think of Murray Rothbard, the late great Murray Rothbard, who preferred to think that The Godfather, one of my favorite films of all time, has an important anarcho-capitalist strain. Now, Murray was right that when, in the beginning of the film, Bonacera, the undertaker, asked Don Corleone for justice, we realized that the government courts cannot administer it. So that's sort of like about government and its dereliction of power. And when the Don says to Bonacera, he will not kill the abusers of Bonacera's daughter because, as he explains to Bonacera, that's not justice. Your daughter is still alive. It's certainly true that that the Don is articulating a sort of nuanced value about retribution and punishment, which Murray Rothbard also liked. And of course, there was a great libertarian point when Michael Corleone tells Kay that his father is like any powerful man, like a senator or congressman. And Kay says that's Don Corleone, is Michael's father. Michael, don't be naive, Kay says. Senators and congressmen don't have people killed. And there's a pause, and Michael says, look who's being naive, Kay. So all that's libertarian and a little bit about the abuse of power. But even Rothbard conceded that it's too bad the Don won't allow Jack Waltz to refuse to give Johnny Fontaine the part in the picture. I mean, the Don is not exactly our ideal of the free market. And so I really can't call that great film a libertarian or really about the abuse of power. So having swept the boards of films that I don't think make it, I want to recommend a few that do. And that includes a film called The Lives of Others, That's in German with English subtitles. It's a thriller about resistance, basically peaceful resistance, and the oppression of the German Stasi under the during the days of East Germany, under the regime of the German Democratic Republic. It's a vivid portrayal of the government abuse of power under the communist regime in East Germany, and I recommend it highly for its very melodramatic, very pleasing plot that I think is very well sewn together at the end with a bit of a surprise ending as well. So that's The Lives of Others. The other film that I think rates in terms of being about the abuse of power is In the Name of the Father. That's with Daniel Day-Lewis and with Emma Thompson. It's based on a true story of an Irish troublemaking kid who was framed by the British police, and about Emma Thompson's fight to get him out of prison and get him cleared. It has terrific performances. In the Name of the Father, in a way, is mainly shows the film depicts the relationship between Daniel Day-Lewis and his father, played by Pete Postlethwaite. So it's a beautiful family film, striking and searing, but it's also a stirring film about the complicity of the police and of the cops in framing an innocent young man, and of Emma Thompson's fight to get him released from prison. The third film I recommend is called Loving. Loving is set in the South, and it's based on the true story of a man whose name was Loving. His last name was Loving. He was a simple bricklayer, and in the South of, I believe it was late 1940s, he meets and marries a black woman, and he marries her, and it's clear, factually clear, and of course this again is based on a true story. Their marriage was against the law, and it's about how the state hounds them because of their love. It sounds a little bit sentimental, but I guess the understated performances by the two leads, especially by the man named Loving, make it especially memorable. Two other films that are basically about independent businessmen fighting the forces of crony capitalism. Those two are Tucker, The Man and His Dream is the title, and it stars Jeff Bridges, also based on a true story about Tucker, played by Jeff Bridges, who had innovative ideas for the building, the marketing, manufacture of automobiles, and how he has to oppose the established firms who use the instruments of crony capitalism to try to crush him. And a similar theme, also a vivid film, is called The Aviator, played by Leonardo DiCaprio. He is playing the illustrious Howard Hughes, but most of the film is indeed about Leonardo DiCaprio's fight against the crony capitalists. The villain, beautifully played by Alan Alda, tries to oppose him, and I won't tell you how that movie ends. So that's the Tucker, The Man in His Dream, and The Aviator, both pretty vivid films about the evils of government's crony capitalism. Three more, I guess. I believe that Serpico, a film from years back starring Al Pacino in a brilliant performance. Al Pacino plays the crusading cop Serpico. I gather that the story is it's based, of course, on a real life character named Serpico, although I gather it takes a lot of liberties with the truth, but that's less important than the fact that it is a vividly told, gritty tale. Stanley Lumet at his best, Sidney Lumet at his best. Sidney Lumet did a number of films set in gritty New York City, and I think Serpico is his best, and it's about Al Pacino, the principled cop, fighting and often fruitlessly fighting and resisting the corruption all the way to the top of the New York City Police Department. It has an implicit indictment of Mayor John Lindsay at the time. And I do think that it qualifies legitimately as a film about the abuse of power. And of course, again, qualifies legitimately as a vivid film with colorful characters and with a powerful message to boot. The only anti-drug war film that I can think of that does make it, and it oddly doesn't make it, even though it almost seems like a theme picture, is Traffic, directed by Steven Soderbergh and starring Michael Douglas. Its characters are also three-dimensional, and yet it manages through its depiction of Michael Douglas, who's a government man, whose daughter is an addict, and also scenes from set in Mexico, depicting the drug war. All of it pretty much well pulled together. It runs for about 3 hours. All of it quite absorbing. Despite the fact that it does take a lot of time with its characters and it does deal in ambiguities, its message is fairly clear that the government's drug war is fruitful and criminal. I should mention my other favorite movie, not a movie, actually a series about drugs and drug lords, is called Breaking Bad. I highly recommend it, although I can't quite say that it has the theme of abolishing drugs, although I was amused by a young libertarian who points out that you can tease out certain libertarian themes from Breaking Bad. So I'm sneaking in Breaking Bad as a recommendation, even though it doesn't quite qualify as a movie that unambiguously depicts government abuse of power. Far from it. My final pick is a movie called Last Flag Flying, starring Bryan Cranston, who made a name for himself starring in Breaking Bad. He delivers a riveting performance, as do several other actors. It is an anti-war film with no battle scenes, surprisingly effective, and truly about government's abuse of power, in that it's pretty devastating about the awfulness of government's wars. And so again, I highly recommend that. Last Flag Flying. All of them films that I think are long-lasting in terms of aesthetic appeal, in terms of emotional appeal, but all of them having the message that government's abuse of power should stop. Well, that's the softball question. Let me get to some of the harder questions. Here's one from our own Hermie Wang. I call her our own Hermie Wang because she's on our staff and she makes important contributions to the Soho Forum. She had 3 questions, and I guess I'll try to deal with at least 2 of them right now. The first one is, do you think we're heading into a prolonged recession? Well, I did an interview with Dave Smith on his Part of the Problem podcast, so I recommend that you tune into that, just Part of the Problem with Dave Smith, in which I discuss at great length my view that we're not really in a depression or in a recession, but in the midst of what I call the Great Suppression. That is, it's something unique. It's not typically an Austrian-like business cycle with malinvestment. It's the government's great suppression of good investment. And that good investment includes the Soho Forum. We had to shut down, as you know, our operations because of government's edict. Maybe we would have stopped doing so, even so, because of the dangers involved. But certainly other businesses have had to shut down, and they might have been able to manage it. We might have been able to manage it. We might have been able to invite fewer people, have them sit further apart. But in any case, whether or not we were able to do that, we were suppressed, as have so many other good businesses been suppressed. And when I say then that I don't think this is going to be a prolonged recession, I don't think we're heading into anything prolonged. That's because I think it's a suppression of good investment. And when the government sees fit, maybe it's doing it for the right reason, maybe not, that's another matter. But when the government sees fit to lift this suppression, I think a lot of that good investment, those companies that are viable, are going to come back on stream. And I think it's possible that the recession will end by the summer quarter. That very much depends on how soon we get it together with respect to controlling COVID-19. But certainly it's possible that as soon as the third quarter, we'll begin to climb out of this great suppression. Again, for more details on that, I recommend my interview of a week or so ago with Dave Smith on the Part of the Problem podcast. A second question from Hermie. What books would you recommend to someone who doesn't identify as a libertarian to read? Hermie, if you actually listen to Tom Wood's podcast, he's done many podcasts with people asking them, how do they become libertarians? You find that there are so many ways in through reading and through other experiences that it's hard to know what to recommend. I did an interview with Tom. I did actually something called Gene Epstein Week with him about a couple of months ago. And there I told my own story, and my way in, my reading was really weird. I read Murray Rothbard's Man, Economy, and State, a 2-volume tome on economics, and that was my way into libertarianism. But that's probably not something to recommend to others. The best answer I can give you is are books by a woman named Mary Ruwart, R-U-A-R-T. Mary Ruwart. And maybe the first one to try on people you know who aren't libertarians is an easy read called Short Answers to the Tough Questions. How to answer questions that libertarians need to answer. Short answers to the tough questions for libertarians, and how to answer those questions. You can find the book on Amazon. It's available on Kindle, I noticed. The subtitle I should read, Short Answers to the Tough Questions, How to Answer the Questions Libertarians Are Often Asked. That's the book that I would try first. Mary Ruwart writes with great sensitivity, and I think that the image of libertarians as being hard-edged and cynical and selfish is very much dispelled, very easily dispelled by reading Mary Ruwart. Again, that's R-U-A-R-T. Her other book that I recommend has a title typical of her sensibility, Healing Our World, The Compassion of Libertarianism. Again, those are two books by Mary Ruwart. The third question from Hermie, I'll probably deal with more briefly. This has to do with what I think of my thoughts on the laws with respect to intellectual property. And as that has to do with patents and copyrights. And I do think, as Hermie probably knows, that it's understandable that libertarians are deeply divided on the issue of intellectual property. I myself believe that there's a heavy burden of proof because on those who would defend this intervention by the state to declare that the creation of your mind is intellectual. The heavy burden of proof that I think ultimately they can't deal with. But let me go into that question a little bit more deeply maybe during the next episode, because I guess so what? We're beginning to run out of time. The next question that I want to deal with is with from Connor O'Keefe. He writes, I've been hearing people claim that this pandemic proves that we in the United States are too reliant on foreign goods, especially medicine from China. Some are even claiming it's a matter of national security. How would you respond to this? Connor O'Keefe, I don't think that there's any evidence that this is a matter of national security. I see no evidence that the Chinese, who do produce a fair amount of medicine, I gather a fair amount of drugs also come from Italy, interestingly enough. We do import a lot of, at least the ingredients in the drugs that we consume. These are those supply chains. And I don't see evidence at all that China is not willing to sell us goods of this kind or is waging any war of that kind on us. The Chinese economy is suffering. There are people having trouble getting jobs. So I see no reason why we shouldn't have completely open trade with China. Those who are aware of my debate with Stephen Moore know that I think it's horrible what Trump has done with respect to a trade war with China. The only thing to say about that is that when you talk about we, it's certainly prudent if you run a business, just prudent if you run a business, to diversify. Usually businesses do that. Diversify, that is, in terms of your supply chains, recognizing that if you are importing from abroad, that reliance on any one place for what you want to buy is usually imprudent. And so perhaps this is to some degree a wake-up call about not totally relying on China and I gather Italy for too many of our drugs. But the idea that the nationalists and the the chauvinists are suddenly going to declare that we can't ever buy anything from China and that this is that kind of wake-up call, I challenge them to try to point out to us how any business or group in China or including government-dominated industries, how any of them are unwilling in any way to sell us drugs. And so I see no justification whatsoever for that claim being made. Next question. Lisa Gansky asks, if you could hang out with our president for one day and advise him on anything, what would you tell him? Well, you know, Lisa, my first impulse was to give you the flip answer, you know, and say I would tell him to resign because he's obviously an incompetent. But then again, that's pretty hopeless because then we get his vice president replacing him, although maybe the vice president, you can't get in a way much worse than Trump in my view, and his vice president isn't necessarily better, but then again, what else could I tell President Trump? Or maybe I could be flip and tell President Trump, you should resign and make sure that you get some libertarian to replace you, some flip answer. But something did occur to me just this morning that takes your question seriously. I do think it's hopeless to be able to tell Trump things like lift your tariffs on China, or even to tell him anything much about foreign policy. He has good impulses as well as terrible impulses, and it's pretty clear that he listens to himself and doesn't listen to anybody else. But grasping at straws, it occurred to me that something is going on at the White House and currently that does give me a little hope, and that has to do with the use of the repurposed drugs to treat COVID-19. And I've read a lot of criticisms of what's going on with respect to the use of the repurposed drugs. But I think that it's important to recognize that even though we don't have conclusive evidence that these drugs that, for example, are used normally to treat malaria are effective with COVID-19, we don't have clear and unambiguous evidence, even though we've got a lot of case studies showing that a whole lot of people seem to have recovered through the use of those drugs. But of course, ultimately, you can also always say that unless the studies are done ultra carefully, we can never be sure that those people who recovered wouldn't have recovered anyway. So you need something really systematic, like the double-blind placebo test. Give some of them placebo, give them some of them repurposed drug, randomize the population, and then follow up to make sure that the repurposed drugs work. But I've been persuaded, as in fact by a guy I won't name because I don't want to implicate him, but he is a prominent physician who's written a bit about this. I've been persuaded that there are many drugs that begin to start to get used strictly based upon clinical experience of doctors. Drugs that were approved for certain purposes, but then they turned out to be useful because of the doctor's clinical experience for very different purposes. So that's the whole idea of repurposing these drugs. And the success that many practitioners are having with the use of these repurposed drugs to treat COVID-19 is such that it is worth a try. Because a lot is known already about their side effects, and so they're relatively safe to use. And so if somebody's in has serious problems with respect to COVID-19, why not make use of the drug and see if it works? And then hope that more studies are done on this. Well, this loops back to President Trump. He's been criticized for saying that he's pretty excited about the potential use of these drugs. He ought to reach out to President Obama. He ought to reach out to anybody he could find to see, including, by the way, if he wants to get in touch with me, with the doctors that are out there, including French doctors who are encouraged by the use of this drug. He ought to do more about that particular interest and enthusiasm. He was attacked just the other day in an editorial in the New Yorker about talking in these terms. He's being attacked by the World Health Organization. But it seems to me that the logic of pushing through and giving these drugs a try is a good idea. And so, again, to answer your question, if I could hang out with our president for one day and advise him on anything, what would I tell him? I would tell him, Mr. President, you should do everything you can to promote interest and by the way, the continued manufacture of these repurposed drugs to treat COVID-19. On the other hand, of course, Lisa, that wouldn't take me a whole day to tell President Trump. And so I would probably just take, an hour, a half hour of President Trump's time and tell him those things, because anything else I could tell him would be pretty hopeless. Well, I guess we have time for one more question. I'm not keeping track of time completely, but this is a question from Frank Gambino, and I'll deal with this. Frank has a couple of questions. I'll just deal with his first one. Frank asked me, when this passes, and if the economy doesn't completely collapse, rulers will claim great victory and receive adoration. Will it be much harder to get the libertarian view out there? Well, Frank, you're probably aware of the old point that originated in the work of the great Robert Higgs, that when there's a crisis, the government doesn't let it go to waste. They clamp down on us. They tighten their power over our lives. And then when the crisis passes, they loosen their power, but they claim great victory and they receive adoration. And then the environment is not quite what it used to be. That was certainly true in the 9/11 crisis. The government claimed great victory. It tightened control over us. And post 9/11, we lived in a world that had more government domination of our lives than existed pre 9/11. So that could happen again. The only special silver lining in this particular crisis, Frank Gambino, the only ray of hope that I would point to is that it's getting so widely recognized that that regulation of our economy often makes no sense. Regulations are being loosened because, after all, we've got to get on with things. Regulations that have been imposed by the FDA, for example, are being loosened. And then we libertarians might then ask, well, if you're now marching in the other direction, loosening controls over us, then maybe you shouldn't return those controls. Because if those regulations make no sense now, why will they make any sense once the crisis has passed? Maybe you recognize that there are trade-offs to everything, and that all of the regulations that have been impeding the fight against COVID-19 that are beginning to be loosened perhaps should stay loose. And so that in that way, maybe that will give us the opportunity to get the libertarian view out there all the more. Well, let me conclude this first segment then of Ask Gene Anything. There are other questions remaining, which I'll get to in the next episode. And meanwhile, I hope you all stay well. And I also hope that pretty soon I'll see you again live and in person at the Soho Forum. Thanks a lot.